He is risen. Our text this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, beginning in verse 13. We heard a paraphrase or a summary of it earlier. I'm going to read just a section of this story. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see him." Then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. Please join me in. So in our text this morning, we hear about these two disciples, and there's all kinds of conversation around whether these disciples, who they were, right? We know one of them was named Cleopas. There is discussion about whether the second disciple was a man or whether it was Cleopas's wife. All of those things are really not all that important to the story. The piece that captures my imagination is that idea that the text gives us when it says, "But we had hoped." You know, life has a way of taking hard left turns. I'm sure some of you, if not all of us, have experienced at one point or another a day that went a direction that we did not foresee. Maybe it is news that we received at a doctor's appointment. Or maybe it is that moment when your boss says, "Would you come into my office?" Or maybe it's a moment where something happens with a loved one. And in those moments, we can identify with what these disciples say on the road. But we had hoped. Nope. Okay. But we had hoped that the iPad would not fail on Easter Sunday. Oh, Steve Jobs, where are you now? But we had hoped. And so these moments where life all of the sudden changes, we can recognize this feeling, right? These two disciples, whether it's a couple or whether it's two male disciples, as they walk along, they're trying to make sense of how all of their hopes, of how this man who was so powerful, who demonstrated the presence of God in such an amazing way, was dead, was gone. How everything had changed in the last several days. So as they are walking along the road, the text tells us, depending on which translation you read, it's that they were discussing, they were arguing. The Greek gives us a sense that this was not a dispassionate, shall we say, conversation. They were arguing or really invested in this conversation, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. And then the text says, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So as they walk along, trying to figure out what life means now, the resurrected Christ shows up beside them and begins to ask questions. What is it that you are talking about? And they're incredulous. They can't believe that anyone has not heard about what has happened to Jesus. It strikes me that we often find ourselves walking on the road, trying to figure out what it is that has happened to us. And whether or not those things are external to us or things that perhaps are the result of decisions we made in our lives, we are disoriented. You know, there's a term that has a lot of people talking in the church, in the wider church these days, that is for some considered an example of just how terrible our culture is, and for others it is considered just part of what is called discipleship. That word is deconstruction. People are struggling with what they've been taught. People are struggling with what they see with their own eyes. And they're trying to make sense of the world, and sometimes, quite frankly, of the church. They don't know how it is that what they knew about Jesus here matches up to what they are seeing and experiencing in real time. And so as they walk, they had hoped. They had seen Jesus, and life has shown up in a way that makes them question, well, what does this mean? And where is Jesus now? What is it that I'm experiencing? And so as they walk, they discuss and they think and they cry out. And I would argue that the resurrected Christ shows up on that road regardless of how you got there. So maybe it's a crisis of faith, if you will. Maybe it's a crisis in your family. Maybe it's a crisis with your health. Maybe it is any number of things that cause you to question what it is. Where is Jesus in the midst of this experience? And you find yourself with these two disciples, uttering those words. But we had hoped. I had hoped. I had hoped that this Jesus thing was real. I really thought that he was the one. I remember a day I was talking with someone this last week it was another pastor, about our identities. And one of the things that's challenging as a pastor is we have these roles where we recognize that we have a role. We're a pastor, and that's our job. But a healthy pastor remains aware that their primary identity is not in being a pastor. It's in being a child of God. But the challenge with being a pastor in particular is that because our jobs are kind of encompassing, it's really hard to keep those lines straight. Now, I will say, as one who has been doing this for a long time, there was a season in my life where I took great pride in the fact that I knew who I was. I'm a child of God. I'm a pastor. That's what I do. That is not who I am. Until my lead pastor came into my office one day and shared news with me that turned my life upside down. And 3 months later, I was driving limo across the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, and I realized, as I listened to a sermon, that I had hoped. I did not know what was next. I felt the weight of so much on me. The weight of 3 college-age kids. And here I am driving limo. And all of a sudden I realized that I had work to do, because that role that I thought I had so clearly defined was not as clear as I thought. And the Jesus that I thought I knew, I was questioning. I had hoped. But the treatment and the things that I was seeing in my life, in my professional life, in the church, were causing me to ask questions. And Jesus showed up on that walk in so many different ways that I don't even have time to tell you about all of them. But he did show up. And Jesus, as he did with the disciples, firmly but gently says, "Why are your hearts so slow to believe the words of the prophets?" You see, one of the challenges for us, friends, is that, like my role getting muddy, sometimes our belief, our faith gets muddy, and we lose sight of what it is, or who it is, more precisely, that we have faith in. You see, sometimes we begin to think that what we see in the world and in the church are indicative of the reality of the claims of Jesus, when in reality they are not. The only reality that we put our faith in is the risen Christ, who shows up no matter where we are in that journey. And so Jesus begins to explain to these disciples how it was that the Messiah had to come and suffer. Now, you'll remember, as we've been journeying and walking through Luke, this is a theme that Jesus comes back to, not just in Luke, but all the Gospels, over and over again, trying to explain to the disciples and those that he's talking to that he has to suffer and die. That is the shape of discipleship. And the way of following Jesus is the cross-shaped way. It means that we, with Jesus, will walk towards our cross. And ultimately, we too must suffer. Jesus then, as they continue to walk, they begin to feel something stir in their hearts. They begin to wonder. I love that word, wonder. I'm reminded of a quote from, which I am going to slaughter because, no notes, that Rabbi Abraham Heschel said once that he asked God for wonder, and he gave it to him. He gave it to me. These two disciples are walking with Jesus, and that wonder is starting to stir in their hearts as Jesus explains the Scriptures. And then they get to where they're going, and Jesus just makes like he's going to continue walking on. And the text tells us that they asked him, they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us." That wonder had been stirred, and they wanted more. They wanted to hear more. They wanted to understand what it was that was happening. And then Jesus went in, and he sat at table with them. And the text tells us that he took bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them, and their eyes were opened. I don't know where you find yourself on the road towards Emmaus, but one of the things that I find fascinating about this part of this story is that it gives us the form of the Christian life. Jesus took bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. Now, one of the fascinating things, in a couple weeks, we're going to start in the book of Acts, and we'll hear those words again. And we'll see that form start to take shape in the community of followers of Jesus when the text tells us that they gathered together every day and they studied the Scriptures and they broke bread and they prayed. Friends, wherever you find yourself on the journey, whether you find yourself as one who had hoped or further along on that journey, the place that we find hope is sometimes the very place that makes us question the resurrection. It's the church. It's that gathered community where together we break bread, or we bless bread, we break it, and we give it to each other, and we experience the risen Christ. Jesus comes and he joins those disciples at table, and their eyes are opened, and then he disappears. And they say, "Were not our hearts burning?" And then the text says that that same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. They're back on the road away from Emmaus. Brothers and sisters, my hope for you this resurrection day is that in your life, whether you find yourself walking toward Emmaus or whether you are at that point where your heart is, you're experiencing maybe just even the glimmer of that wonder of could it be? Could it be that everything I thought the faith was about isn't really it, but it's really about this resurrected Jesus? Or whether you're walking, practically probably running back towards Jerusalem to share that news with your friends. My hope is that you experience the resurrected one, because he meets you wherever you are. No matter what you've done, no matter what you've thought, he shows up on whatever road you're walking. And maybe he shows up in the form of a friend who asks you questions that are mildly annoying. Like, are you not, don't you know what happened in my life? And in those questions, the wonder begins to stir. And the resurrected one shows up, bringing with him wholeness and joy. Doesn't answer all the questions, but it sends you back out on that road to share that wonder with a world, with family, with friends who are desperate for some resurrection. So friends, go now, knowing that he is alive and that he will show up in your life wherever you find yourself. There is no road too long that Jesus is not walking it. He is risen.